So finally, we have the last lecture. I apologize for how late this is coming. A couple of things contributed to that. One of those being I got sick. Another being that I had to deal with quite a lot of cheating on the final project. I considered giving sort of a long discussion about cheating here, but well, the term is over. I don't want to focus on it. And you guys are third and fourth year students. You know cheating is wrong. You know that it hurts you. It hurts your classmates. Hurts the prestige of the university in the long run. So I won't say any more about that. Okay, on to more fun things. This lecture we're going to talk about how statistical mechanics has made its escape from physics. So I'm going to cover a couple of topics at kind of a surface level just to give you a taste of how these things go. One will be in neuroscience, though it's a particular example in neuroscience, but actually statistical mechanics shows up in a lot of places in biological, in biophysics, and it gets called biophysics because, well, we're taking physics and trying to apply it to biology. But really in many different biological systems, statistical mechanics can lend a helping hand. Then I'll talk about a couple of examples from social sciences, looking at the dynamics of opinion, the construction of hierarchies in culture, and I will mention briefly some work that I've been doing recently with an economist friend applying statistical physics to economics. Before we get into all of that, though, there was a discussion in Piazza about how to draw the letters zeta and xi, and I promised there to give a little tutorial, so just a minute or two worth to show you how to draw these guys. They look imposing, but actually they're not so bad once you get the hang of it. Here is your brief tutorial on how to draw the difficult Greek letters of zeta and xi. So I've drawn here already 3 letters. The first one is a cursive C, the second one is a zeta, and the third one is a xi. If you can do the cursive C, you can do the zeta. And if you can do the zeta, you can do the xi. So let me just show you what I mean by that. If I make a cursive C, right, it's a little loop, come down, I've got a C. That one kind of looks like garbage because I'm standing up trying to draw. Let me try that one more time. Loop, down, it's a C. So the zeta, you're going to make exactly the same motion, except when you get to the bottom of the curve, instead of curving back up, you're going to hook backwards. All right, so now I make a little loop. Coming down, it looks like a C. Oh, wait, turn down. There you go. My zeta looks better than my C. Okay, one more time. Make a little loop. Come around like you're making a C. Oh, turn around, go back. There's your zeta. Okay. And now, if you want to make a C, it's the same motion, just get a little more enthusiastic about curving that C. Right? So I'm going to make a little loop, coming around harder. Oh, make another loop. Oh, coming around again. And now make the hook back. Okay. How big or small you make that little loop in the middle. If you want to be fancy and have no loop, okay, good luck. You can do that too. All right. So the little loop at the top, come down and hook back. Okay. So give that a try. Cursive C to zeta to xi. I think you'll see that you can actually do it. Practice a little bit. It'll come naturally. The first result that I want to discuss is referred to as the Hopfield model. It comes from this paper from 1982, John Hopfield, and hey, it's important enough that somebody named the model after him. Okay. Must be good. And in fact, if you look on Google Scholar, this paper has like over 20,000 citations. So this started a big thread of inquiry into how neural networks and statistical physics connect to each other. Now, this is not necessarily a super realistic model of neurons, though if you start digging through the 20,000 papers that have followed it, people will be slowly working this toward more and more realistic ideas. What was so great about what Hopfield did was demonstrate that with a relatively simple system, you could create something that looked, at least qualitatively, like memory. And when I say qualitatively like memory, there's a couple of things that go into that, right? One is, if you're given a previously learned piece of information, you should be able to recall it. But moreover, if you're given something close to a previously learned piece of information, it should lead you to the memory that it's based on. Okay. So, as sort of a crude example, right? People have built these fantastic large-scale neural network programs. You train them on 100 million dogs images, and now with like 99% probability, they'll correctly classify a dog if you give them another dog. Right? Whereas for humans, we don't have to be trained on 100 million images, right? But we have sort of a general sense of dogness just from encountering a few examples. What comes out of this Hopfield model is the idea that when you're given a stimulus that's relatively close to the memory, this model will classify it into the correct memory bin. So there's basically the way this model works. It's like the icing model in that you postulate that you have little two-state objects on a lattice. Okay, they're either, you could say, spin up or spin down. But if we're talking about neurons, we're going to talk about whether they're excited or not excited. So an excited neuron is one that's firing, that's giving a pulse train. Maybe I should step back a little bit, but I don't want to say too much about biology since definitely not my area of expertise. But a neuron is, a cell in your brain. It's got sort of a cell body that does all the stuff any cell does, with metabolism and reading the DNA and all that. And then there's all of these little fingers that stick out from the cell body. And those are called dendrites, right? And they accept signals from other neurons. And then there's this long tail that comes away. Doesn't have to be super long, but there's a tail that comes away called the axon. And at the end of the axon, you get another branching structure. So there's a branch at the top that allows it to receive signals from many different neurons. Then you've got this tail, and at the end of the tail, it branches again so that it can send signals to many different neurons. Okay. If a neuron is excited, that means it's sending out a pulse of signals down that axon. Okay. How does it get excited? Well, it gets the right signals from other neurons, and it says, "Whoa, time for me to fire," and it starts firing. So Hopfield took what's actually very complicated biophysical dynamics and boiled it down to yes or no. Am I firing or am I not? And then he made this sort of a finite time thing. He said, okay, we're going to have a snapshot. Are things firing or not? Then we can step forward in time. Are they firing again? The model basically says you have random connections between all of your little neurons to start with. And then you train them. You train them by impressing some firing pattern on them and adjusting the weights of all those different interconnections to match that firing pattern. And you do that for different things, okay, different input data. If you've got n neurons, right, you know this from the icing model. If you've got n spins, each is a two-state system, that means you have 2 to the n potential states. That's a ton of states, right? what Hopfield showed is that if you train with this rule, okay, and then you present a new input that doesn't exactly match any of the training input, and then you allow the system to relax to a low energy state. Okay, so now we're going to treat this like the icing model, in the sense that you've got weights connecting, and the weights connecting are like that epsilon cofactor on the S1.S2. Okay. So you'll have these weights, and you'll relax down to the lowest energy state, starting from a particular input. And the idea is that this model has a bunch of local minima of energy. Not sure which one is the global minimum. Maybe there isn't a one global minimum. Maybe there's a degeneracy amongst these many local minima. But if you start near a training input, then as you relax to lower and lower energy, you're relaxing toward that training example. Okay. So this becomes a model for how you can have a system that has many stable states, and that those stable states can be modified over time in response to inputs. So let me just roll a little bit through this paper to give you some idea of what he's doing. Right, so this sort of sigmoid shape here, the solid line, that's similar to a real firing curve for a neuron, right? Based on the excitatory potential that it receives, it has some probability to fire. And that has sort of a sigmoid shape. There's kind of a threshold, but of course it's probabilistic all through here. And basically what Hopfield is doing with this model is changing it to use a simpler picture, which is this hard threshold, right? If it's below a certain input, it will not fire at all. If it's above that input, it will fire with 100% probability. Okay, so he's simplifying this dynamic. And what he's essentially showing is that if we have this sort of interconnected model, and we have some nonlinearity around a firing threshold, we can produce something that looks like a memory. Okay. So I showed you the paper because this is actually something that you could sit down and read yourself at this point. This is one of these, it's a paper that starts a field, which means he's starting in a totally new direction. And given that, he sort of has to start from the beginning and build it up. So you could actually sit down and read this paper yourself if you were interested. So you've got your citation here. And hopefully you know that you can actually log into journals through the library proxy, although this, Proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences, is actually open access. So you could just go read this. Okay. So this is how he's, one of the many ways, he's oversimplifying the brain. And then he just works through what are the consequences of this. And one consequence is, here's an example where he considered 100 neurons. Now, why so few? Because it was 1982 and he was trying to do numerical simulations. Okay. You saw in the last lecture, on my laptop, I can simulate 40,000 icing spins pretty robustly. So not only could you go read this paper, you could go do the same numerics he did, but on much larger samples because, well, turns out almost 40 years of computer technology advancement is quite a thing. Okay, but he's working with 100 neurons, and what he found is if I try to encode 5 memories, then the retrieval is almost 100% accurate every time. If I try to encode 10 memories, now I start to get some errors, right? So this is the number of errors for a given trial state. And it mostly looks good, right? This is like 60, a little more than 60% retrieval there. And then next highest is still pretty good, 1 error. But then there's this little hump out here where you start getting these big errors. And if you try to remember 15 things in a 100 neuron network, then you have very large error rates becoming probable. Pretty likely, in fact. So this is showing sort of what's the most information you can encode reliably, which is to say it needs some kind of robustness, because if we don't get exactly the training state, we should still end up at the closest trained state. And what he found is if you try to train too many states, put too much memory into the system, then in some sense you don't have a good memory anymore. Yeah, so that and that's more or less it. 5 pages, and sort of launches a whole field just by coming at a new field with the tools of statistical physics. There are a number of examples, that have sort of drawn off this over time. One interesting connection is this connects back to condensed matter, which is a field that we've seen a lot of examples for statistical physics, in that this also ends up modeling a system known as a spin glass, which I'm definitely not going to explain. But anyway, there are connections from physics into biology, and then maybe those biological models connect back to physics in a later date. A lot of interesting interchange there. So next I want to switch over to some examples from the social sciences. This paper, you probably couldn't just sit down and read it quite so easily as the Hopfield model, but you also might be surprised by how much of this you are sort of ready to follow after this course. There's the title if you wanted to look it up, Statistical Physics of Social Dynamics. If you search for that, you should find this paper. And so this is a review paper, which means it covers a lot of different topics under that general heading, rather than being sort of an original research paper. This is always a nice way to get into some new topic. So I want to just particularly highlight 2 things from this paper. The first one is a model of opinion dynamics. Okay. What was that? Something looked familiar. Hey, that seems a bit like when we were numerically simulating the icing model. In fact, it even says icing model. Okay. So one of the tricks of this paper, it could also be called the icing model. We can throw it at everything. Okay. That's a bit oversimplifying. But one idea that you'll see over and over again in trying to apply statistical physics outside of physics is that transitions from disorder to order are important in a lot of different fields. And the icing model really is this sort of simplest, most prototypical model that includes a disorder to order transition. Now, for the icing model, it's as you cool, right? Lowering the temperature takes you from a disordered state like this one to an ordered state like this one, and depending on where you stop, you may get this sort of blocky final state where you've got domains of one spin, domains of the other spin, instead of a disordered mixture, and instead of something that mostly looks like one spin with little random smatterings of the other. So that kind of dynamics, again, it's sort of a prototype for looking at all kinds of different things. And while it's not the icing model, again, the opinion dynamics model that we're going to look at is in a lot of ways reminiscent of the icing model. Have I gone too far? I've gone too far. No, I haven't. There's the picture I'm looking for. Okay. Again, looks suspiciously like some kind of icing business with all of this sort of multi-scale structure to these domains. Okay, so let's take a look. Opinion dynamics is kind of asking, how do people form opinions? And in particular, how do people reach a consensus or a dominant majority opinion? Okay. Because opinion dynamics is sort of connected to decision making, right? If everyone comes to the same opinion, then the decision is made. Now, one of the simplest ways to model this is this thing called the voter model. You, again, set everything down on a regular lattice, on, let's say, a nice square 2D lattice, because that makes the numerics easier, makes it conceptually more straightforward. And in the voter model, the dynamic is the following. We're going to randomly pick one spin. I mean one person. Okay. Randomly pick a point on the lattice. That point is inhabited by a two-state system, right? +1 or -1. And in this case, we're thinking of these as two opposite opinions. Okay. I don't know. Vanilla's better, chocolate's better, right? Do my best to avoid controversial political opinions here. If the idea that vanilla is better fills you with bloodthirsty rage, I'm sorry. Pretend I said strawberry. I don't know. Anyway, so we've got two opposite opinions. And the dynamic here is we randomly pick a person, we'll say, on the lattice, and we randomly pick one of their neighbors. If they have the same opinion as their neighbor, then they stay the same. If they've got a different opinion than their neighbor, they switch. That's it. Okay. So it's in some way got a bit of looking at the crowd nature to it, right? If all of my neighbors are spin up and I'm spin down, then the first time I'm randomly picked to be updated, I'm going to spin up. And I'm going to stay that way because now I match all of my neighbors, right? Whereas if my neighbors are evenly mixed, well, every time my number gets called, I may flip, I may not flip. It's sort of 50-50, depends on which one of my neighbors you select. That'll determine which way I point. And because of this, it gives you both an idea of locality, right? If I look at the average opinion across the entire population, that's not going to influence me as much as the opinion of my best friend, my mother, my brother. There's a notion of locality to it. There's also a bit of a notion of global population, right? Because you are at least averaging over those nearest neighbors over the course of the dynamic. And of course, there's an element of randomness to it. If my neighbor and I are opposite spins, then which one wins depends on which one has randomly been picked as the open to change one versus the one who's going to dictate that change. So it grabs a few of the general ideas that you might expect in how people form their opinions. It's also obviously wildly oversimplified. That's how these things start. You start with a super simple model. You see if it does anything vaguely qualitatively like the real world, and then you start asking, what are we missing? Can we add that in, right? So you're taking a physicist's approach to modeling things and taking it into the social sciences here, okay? This question of opinion dynamics. Now, so I should say also, that idea of updating one spin at a time, picking them randomly, all of that should sound a little bit like what we talked about with the Metropolis algorithm for simulating the icing model. Okay? So there's a couple of ways that this all connects back to statistical physics. What they're showing here is if I start with a sort of closed group that's homogeneous in opinion and a population outside of that closed group that has the opposite opinion, as I let the dynamics run over time, I'll start sort of coarsening the edge here, right? Instead of it just being a hard boundary of like in group with one opinion, out group with the other opinion, well, you start to see the opinions sort of infiltrating each other a bit and more, and you'll start to see a slow diffusion of opinions across the boundary. If instead you start with a completely disordered state, so homogeneous in the sense that it's perfectly mixed, the two opinions, you'll see over time something that looks kind of like what happened when we ran the icing, the Metropolis algorithm for the icing model near the critical point, where you can start with pure disorder, but slowly you get this sort of formation of domains, and the domains may be on different scales, right? Like here's a big domain of the black opinion, and here's a smaller domain, right? Here you can think of this as a very big domain with an intrusion of the other opinion, and so forth. Very, very much like what we talked about with the Metropolis algorithm. And with this, you can start asking some sort of very basic questions about the dynamics of opinions. Now, this model is sort of so simplified that you want to go to something more complex to make meaningful statements. But at least you've seen, sort of qualitatively, yeah, right? If you start with just a random scattering of opinion, people do start to nucleate. They start to coalesce and say like, I like what that guy's saying. And then there's a couple of them. And so then maybe the guy next door is like, wow, if those three people think it, maybe I think it, maybe they've got something, right? So there's something about this dynamic that maybe gives you hope that you could do something more similar to the real world. One sort of obvious change to this model that would go quite a long way is we've assumed that this is on some square lattice, right? People don't live on square lattices. People have sort of complex webs of interconnection. And so an awful lot of this sort of formalism, foundational work that goes into trying to take statistical physics into the social domain is looking at what changes when you go from spins on a square lattice to spins on a network. Okay, a network that's connected more like people are connected to each other, right? It's not that I look, I've got, I'm in this sort of weird boxy neighborhood and all I care about is my neighbor to the north, south, east, and west. But that guy that's catty corner, no, I have no interaction with him. That's not how, that's pretty unrealistic. And from thinking about mean field theory for the icing model that connectivity matters, right? For 1D icing, you're only connected to 2 neighbors, and mean field theory fails completely. 2D, you're connected to 4 neighbors. Mean field theory gives you some qualitatively correct things, maybe doesn't get the critical exponents right. As you go to 3, 4, 5 dimensions, your connectivity goes up and mean field theory becomes better. So that's just one example that you've seen in this course where the level of connectivity matters. There's a whole field studying the statistics of network connections between people, right? So somebody gets a huge data set from Facebook and looks at how many people connect to you as a friend, how many connect to this person, take statistics, what's the average number of friends, what's the variance of the number of friends, this sort of thing. Anyway, it gets much more involved than that, and this paper doesn't really go into that. I just wanted to make a note that even something as ridiculously oversimplified sounding as this, if you make one change, which is to take it from unrealistic connectivity to a more realistic connectivity, it can get dramatically more insightful. Okay, so that's one example I wanted to show you. And I'll just scroll slowly here so you can see there are a lot of refinements to this model. Okay, and now you're seeing some spins are flipping. This is some local majority rules kind of update rule. Okay, you can get more complicated and look at sort of bigger domains. If I have a pair that agree, they can really start ruling the local opinion. Okay, these are all models of how consensus can be reached or how opinions spread and their dynamic. We're going to scroll way down. And formation of hierarchies. So this is a very interesting question, which is to say, when you look at humans or out in, the rest of the animal kingdom, you see hierarchies, right? It's not just humans building hierarchies within their cultures. In troops of monkeys, you have hierarchies. In insect colonies, you have hierarchies. Sort of all levels of animal have hierarchy development. And so you might wonder, what causes that? What are the conditions for that to occur? And so this is the sort of dynamic that people wanted to study, and they came up with these models. We'll look at this sort of simple one, the Bonobo model. Excuse me. The idea here, again, we're going to start on a 2D square lattice because that's our easiest place to start, right? In the model, agents occupy the sites of a 2D square lattice with linear dimension L. The L is not important here. And the idea is you scatter actors or agents around on this lattice with some density. Okay, so, at 0.5, every other lattice site is going to have someone on them, but that doesn't mean you have sort of skip one site. It's just that you'll randomly populate the site until you get to n over 2 agents, and then you stop. Okay. And now what's going to happen for each time step is an agent is picked at random. It makes a random move on its lattice. If it moves to an empty site, move is done. It's moved. No harm, no foul. If the site it tries to move to is occupied, then there's a conflict. They say fight, but conflict. There's some kind of conflict, and there's a winner and a loser. And the winner is picked by the Fermi direct distribution function. How did that happen? So each agent has assigned a value of F, which is the strength, which I assume is coming from like fuerte. Anyway, so F is the strength of that agent. Now, if agent I jumps onto the same site as agent J, we're going to look at the strengths of the two. If I is stronger than J, it should be more likely that I wins. But it's not guaranteed. Okay? And the way that they decided to try to balance this idea of randomness with some kind of ordering is to say, well, okay, fine. Initially, what's going to happen is we look at the difference of strengths. If I is stronger than J, this is positive. Okay? Eta is, well, it's sitting where beta would be, right? Beta is our measure of thermal fluctuation, thermal disorder, or thermal randomness. So eta here is a parameter that determines sort of how random is the winner of these fights, these conflicts. So if eta equals 0, then it's completely irrelevant who is stronger. It's always going to be 50-50, right? You got e to the 0 is 0, you got 1 over 1 plus 1. So this Qij is the probability that I beats J. You can set the randomness factor to 0, but you know this is sitting where beta would be. Beta is really 1 over the randomness. So if you set eta to 0, you're setting the randomness all the way up, which means it's always 50-50 no matter how strong the two are. Flip side, as eta gets really big, right? If Fi minus Fj is positive, then this is going to be e to the negative something big, and the probability that I wins becomes close to 1. And similarly, if I is weaker than j, this will become e to the positive eta, right? Minus makes it a positive eta. So that'll look like 1 over 1 plus a really big number. The probability to win would be very low. Okay. So this is, basically just saying, quantifying how likely is it that someone who's 3 units stronger will win the fight. Okay. Now, whichever agent wins the fight stays on that site. If the one moving wins, then the one that was there before takes the moving guy's old site, right? So if I move from I to J, I win, then the J guy goes back to I. And the question is, when does this dynamic lead to a hierarchy? Okay, so if we start with everyone at F equals 0, nobody is stronger or weaker than anyone else, and we just start this discrete dynamics, time step, okay? What happens? Well, if I and J both have strength 0, then that first fight is going to be random, right? 1 over 1 plus 1. But whoever wins it now has a non-zero f. Okay? And essentially, as we run that dynamic, we may or may not develop a hierarchy. How would we answer that question? I should also say, you also have what they call a relaxation process. What that means essentially is the fact that I won a fight 300 years ago probably doesn't have a whole lot to do with whether I'm winning my next fight. So the strength also decays at some rate. So every time step you lose some fraction of your strength. And what do we have here? Mean field solution. Okay. So if it's a dynamic that sounds kind of vaguely like the Ising model, there's a chance that the type of tools that we used in the Ising model will come in handy. Okay. So I don't want to drag you through all of the math here because I'm really trying to give you just a quick overview of different ideas. But basically what comes out of this is you can write down a differential equation that says if I assume that any position on the lattice is sort of equally as good as any other, that's a mean field approximation, right? You could have one agent that's got strength 1,000,000 over here that's just beating everybody around in this corner of the lattice. This corner of the lattice doesn't know about it. So we're not taking that into account. Saying assume every site is about the same as every other, then the density rho, remember this is sort of the fraction of sites that are filled, that gives you the probability that you're going to have a meeting and a conflict. And so you get this differential equation that tells you the rate of change of the strengths. And then you can solve sort of the dynamics of this by looking at what happens if I start with everyone at 0 strength. And it turns out that there is a critical density. Once you get beyond a certain critical density, hierarchy spontaneously develops in this model, at least in the mean field solution. And if you're below that critical density, then you'll get fluctuations, right? Hey, I won my fight against you. Now my strength has gone up a little. But on average, my strength will go up and down by the same amounts, and it's a wash. So that's the kind of way that you can learn something about this. This is pointing to the idea that you need more than just the possibility of conflict. You need a certain level of conflict before hierarchy is going to spontaneously arise. It's not to say you can't have a hierarchy, take it to a new place with a lower density, and that hierarchy may be stable in the new place. But if you start from a sort of equal point, the question is, can that sort of egalitarian, I'll go ahead and say society, but maybe we should say egalitarian population, can that be stable as a long-term solution? And it turns out, at least in this simplified picture of it, the density is what's important. And now, of course, you have to ask, how realistic is this? And this is sort of the real challenge in the field, is not saying, you've got a social problem. Can I make it look like the Ising model? The question is, once I've picked something that looks like the Ising model, can I move on from that and find something that genuinely gives me meaningful information about the social phenomenon? You may have heard physicists are sometimes not very popular in other fields of study because we tend to wander into them with a very simplified model and say, aha, human beings interact with each other? Have you heard of the Ising model, right? And if you're a sociologist who has spent decades of your life trying to understand the intricacies of human interactions, right? You're an anthropologist who spent your life trying to understand the complexities of culture. A physicist comes in and is like, are you sure we can't just treat this as a 2-level system? It doesn't necessarily go over well all the time. And so while I think a lot of these things are very interesting as stepping off points, and this is maybe getting into editorial now, it's important that as physicists we recognize we're bringing an incredibly oversimplified model. And bringing the model with us is not the most helpful thing that we can do necessarily. It's bringing the ability to say, okay, what's the next thing we need to account for? Okay, so there's quite a lot that you can look at in terms of social dynamics. I've obviously not touched on most of this paper, and this is just one paper. So to give you some idea, there is a lot of this sort of work going on, and some of it's quite interesting. The last example I want to tell you about is something related to research that I'm doing with an economist friend. This is something called the Schelling model. Now, the Schelling model was invented in the 70s, and the question it tried to answer is the following. I believe he was looking specifically at like Milwaukee, but it would have been true of many cities in the 70s. The observation was cities are segregated. Certainly in the 70s in the United States, this was true. Very much true many places even today, including the US. But so people said, hey, civil rights legislation was a success, and yet our cities are still segregated. And the assumption was this must mean that people want to live in a segregated fashion. And yet surveys would find the majority of people said they would like to live in an integrated neighborhood. And so people looked at this result and said, well, gee, people say they want to live in integrated neighborhoods, and yet there aren't integrated neighborhoods. I bet people are just telling us what they think they're supposed to say in a social context. Now, Schelling asked, is this necessarily the case? Or is it possible that most people want to live in an integrated neighborhood, and yet there's a failure of coordination, and so neighborhoods stay segregated? And this idea of failure of coordination is an incredibly important one in economics. Describes a whole host of economic dilemmas. And so Schelling's question was, is this one of those cases? So he came up with this really simple model that he could simulate with like some coins and a chessboard and nothing more. Okay. The idea was the following. Suppose I have two sorts of people, okay? And in my simulation here, I've colored them red and blue, so maybe that means something political. Obviously, Schelling had in mind African American and white. And the question was, if I were to start with a homogeneous distribution, everyone already integrated, and then I randomly move, and I'm going to use the term agent here to describe each individual point here. So I randomly pick an agent, I look around, and I say, am I in a neighborhood I want to be in? And the way he quantified that is to say, what fraction of your neighbors have to be like-minded with you for you to want to stay in the neighborhood you're in? Okay. So again, we can talk about this in terms of sort of political classes or racial classes, as was the original idea. And he said, hey, what if we set this to 50%? Okay. Say, I'm great with living in an integrated neighborhood as long as I'm not the minority in that neighborhood. Okay. And let's just run this dynamic. If I look around and I'm in the minority in my neighborhood, then I'll move to a random new spot without regard to where I'm landing, right? But just if I look around and I see I'm in the minority in my neighborhood, I'll move to a random spot. Let's take it one step further. I won't just say if I'm in the minority. I'll say if my group identity is less than 40% of the neighborhood, then I'll move. So I don't even mind being in the minority. I just don't want to be really in the minority. And if that is the case, then I'll move to a random place. Okay. So that's the dynamic you're going to see here. Okay, I've set the parameters to 40%. So there's a preference to not be in, let's say, a small minority in the neighborhood. So now we just run this. We see things hopping around, hopping around. It started out perfectly mixed, right? That was a totally random initial state. But you can already see you're starting to get some pockets of red here, big pocket of blue here, pockets of red here, and you can just watch the blue ones disappear, right? What Schelling was showing is that even with, oh, sorry, I should tell you what's going on over here. This is a metric for how many of these agents are isolated in their neighborhood, which is to say, how many of these agents find themselves in a neighborhood that's completely homogeneously of their type. And apparently, oh, there we go. I was going to say, just as I pointed at it, it stopped plotting. Yeah. So you can see that we started out totally intermixed. No agents were in isolated neighborhoods. There's maybe a small hitch there, but then pretty quickly we start developing isolated agents. And you can see now there's big patches of unbroken red, big patches of unbroken blue, right? Most of our agents look to be in isolated neighborhoods. This is we're over 50% now. So this is the state we've evolved toward, and I'll just, you get the point. I can reset it again, totally random, run it again. Same thing will happen while I'm talking. Okay. So just to review, we started from a totally integrated neighborhood, or totally integrated city, let's say, and a population that was willing to be in the minority in their neighborhood as long as they weren't strongly in the minority in their neighborhood. And very rapidly, our initially integrated neighborhoods segregate. So this is exactly an example of this idea of a coordination failure. Everyone's ideal would be to live in diverse integrated neighborhoods, and yet because everyone's making independent decisions, the evolution is away from what everyone wants. This failure of coordination, as I said, it comes up in all kinds of guises in economics. Another one is something called the tragedy of the commons, which is to say, if there's some resource that's owned collectively, and the name commons comes from, people used to graze sheep in a common plot in the center of their town or village. And as long as people all grazed sort of, 5 sheep, then the commons could regrow and you could steady state, everyone's happy, their sheep are getting fed. Great. But for each individual agent, right, for each person in the village, if I can graze 6 sheep on that common, I'm 20% better off. And if I'm the only one doing it, well, it's not going to degrade the common, so we're good, right? Now everyone in town thinks that. Suddenly your common is being grazed at 20% above its carrying capacity, and instead of being able to replenish itself, it starts decaying. And in a few years, there's no grass for anybody's sheep to eat. That's a shame. Okay. This is another example of a failure of coordination where the best global outcome is for everyone to do the right thing, but the best local outcome for any one person is for them to do the wrong thing. And in an important sense, I said, if I'm the only one who cheats, right? I'm the only one who goes out and gets an extra sheep fed. Doesn't hurt the common, but it's better for me. The totally opposite end of the spectrum would be for me to say, I know everybody else is going to cheat and take their sheep out. I should get mine too, right? So no matter what the rest of the village does, the best move locally for me is to graze an extra sheep, is to cheat against the common good. So here's an example where we see a different coordination failure. And this is a sad case, right? So this kind of modeling has a general name. It's called agent-based modeling. Okay, so this has a lot of randomness to it. It even ends up looking a little bit like those icing simulations, but less so than the last things I showed you. But so far there hasn't been sort of an explicitly statistical mechanical component to this. So let me stop that and let me show you something that's explicitly statistical mechanical. This is a little hard to see. Let me make it bigger. This is a phase diagram for the Schelling model. So on this axis we have what fraction of the neighborhood my group needs to be for me to be comfortable staying. And on this axis is a density metric. How dense are my neighborhoods? Okay. And what you see here, when it goes yellow, that's extreme segregation. The dark blue is completely integrated. And then the rest of these are sort of, well, if you took sufficiently long time, sort of anything other than the dark blue would eventually become this bright yellow. So the gradations are sort of the slowness of the dynamic towards segregation, right? So if everybody needs to be 80% in the majority in their neighborhood before they're comfortable, and things are low density, you shoot to segregation almost immediately, right? But if things are higher density and people are much more interested in, well, if things are at higher density, then you might ask, how tolerant of being in the minority do folks have to be? And you see, you get the transition at about 30%, a little over. There's a bit of curvature to this, right? But let's say 35 plus or minus a few percent. So people are, I keep saying people, obviously this is within this super simplified model. Take that caveat with you. The agents are willing to be in a 2/3 minority, right? Be 1/3 of the population, their group. And yet still you get this spontaneous segregation. Now, based on the colors of this part of the plot, it's a very slow dynamic, but still, that I think is sort of the troubling take-home message, is that the long-time dynamics can give you something that's very far from people's actual desires, but because you don't have an ability to globally coordinate, you have this failure. Now, there's another interesting aspect to this phase diagram, which is that if people want to be like 90% in the majority before they're comfortable in their neighborhood, well, they just hop around at random forever. Like they never get to that point, right? No one sits still long enough for them to coalesce into a segregated block. So that's sort of a funny thing, which probably just speaks to a lack of realism in the model, but maybe not. I don't know that there's a proper study on this sort of thing where you could start matching this carefully to social data. But so I wanted to show you this because this is less a question of bringing a model with us from physics into a social science, or specifically from statistical physics into a social science, but instead we're bringing a tool of statistical physics, which is to say phase diagrams, right? We say a model that has a lot of randomness probably has some rich structure just as a function of its different parameters. And so, for instance, maybe you would find, well, if we want, as a global thing, we want to reach integration, then, we have some idea about the parameters to work with. The density of our city may be fixed. And then you might say, geez, in a poll, people say they don't want to be in the minority. Maybe, I don't know, education, outreach, somehow you move that number down and you say, there is a transition where we can get to everyone's global maximum. Okay. So that's, again, as I said, this is a place where you can bring tools from statistical physics and apply them to models that have come from social sciences or economics. And with that, you can enrich the dynamic. I said this is related to some work I'm doing. This is sort of like the 0th step of some work that we're doing in trying to understand how economic firms come into existence and then how their structure grows and changes with time. Anyway, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening with statistical physics techniques and statistical physics models, moving them out of statistical physics into the broader scientific world. And I expect that this will only accelerate with time, as there's just so many places to explore, so many places to look with this sort of thing. So I hope that you've enjoyed the term, that you've learned a lot of good physics that you'll take with you into your other physics courses, and hopefully maybe a bit of a mindset or a technique for looking at problems that don't necessarily look like physics, because they aren't, but that maybe that mindset can still somehow suggest new avenues and new ideas to explore. Okay, this lecture was running long, but I just wanted to throw one more example in, because I think I'd mentioned this in some earlier lectures. The idea of using statistical mechanics to understand music. I'm just going to show you the paper. You can look this up. This is a paper that I think you could actually look at and get some appreciation for, just from what you've learned in this course. It caused a bit of controversy in my house because my wife is a composer, and she was not terribly fond of the idea that physics could just come and drop down some kind of statistical mechanics model and tell you interesting things about music. And it's a valid question. Is this actually telling you anything interesting about music? The basic idea is just music is some trade-off between dissonance, which we want to avoid in principle, and complexity, which we want more of, right? And the author makes a mapping of this onto something that looks like free energy, right? Free energy is a trade-off between getting the least energy in the system versus getting the most randomness in the system. And he says, hey, great. Let's think of dissonance like energy. We want to minimize that. But let's think of randomness as, well, entropy, randomness, right? We want to maximize that. And so this temperature, which is not really a temperature, right? This is, maybe you could call it temperament. That still starts with a T, right? How much dissonance are you willing to put up with to reach a level of complexity? Okay, so entropy in the sort of information theory sense is a measure of complexity. Now, white noise has extremely high entropy and extremely high dissonance, right? So this is the idea of this trade-off. If I took the 12-tone scale and randomly throw notes together, that would have complexity and less dissonance, right? Because it's at least a 12-tone scale. If someone puts it together in a less random fashion, you may get much less dissonance, but also less complexity, right? And so there's just this trading off. Now, this sounds a bit like this is just a semantic thing, but he goes on and does some, I'm going to say the modeling is interesting, and then leave it up to you whether the results are interesting. So he has these dissonance functions that says, hey, if the frequencies are this close together, then I'm going to be unhappy about it, right? And then if they get further apart, I'm not unhappy about it anymore. And okay, this is some like response function that you get by using one of these dissonance functions to model human hearing. There's a lot that goes into this. Anyway, one of the take-home messages is as you turn down the temperature, in other words, turn down the extent to which you favor randomness, you go from what does look like white noise, so this is frequency and probability that it appears in your piece. You go from something that looks like white noise to something that condenses out to 12 tones, and then you get one tone with a few others still surviving, and eventually, as you keep turning down the temperature, you just get a single tone, right? Most people don't want to listen to white noise. Hats off to those of you who are in the white noise camp. It can be fun. No one wants to just sit and listen to a single tone for an hour, right? That wouldn't make much of a concert. So the temperature that sort of corresponds to most people's enjoyment level is going to be somewhere in between these two. And again, there's sort of a lot of stuff that goes on in here. He looks at different dissonance functions and finds that you only get discrete particular numbers of notes. And in particular, 12, which is like classical Western music. The 5, I believe it was, shows up in gamelan. 31 looks like microtonal modern composition. So this looks like maybe some super exciting things are going on. I will say, it may also just be that this guy has done a bunch of very fancy math to rederive something that was known over 100 years ago, which is just that particular even subdivisions of an octave give you more or less dissonant pitch classes. So it may just be, sort of that not anything interesting has been learned, even though there's a mean field model, it must be good, right? So I just wanted to mention this music paper so that if you're curious, this ends up talking about a whole bunch of issues that we've discussed this term, because he's sort of saying, hey, let's apply statistical mechanics to music. No one's done that before, so I can define a free energy. I can have interacting models. I can look at mean field theory for the model. So, okay, I'm going to stop there before this lecture gets entirely too long, but I did want to give you that last bit.